Hey there, everybody. Happy holidays and welcome to this super special extra bonus episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This will be episode number 171. Since this is really a full, proper episode of the podcast, it is a live recording of a session that I moderated, a panel of wonderful guests talking about graduate student wellness that took place at the Times Higher Education Campus US Live event that took place in November in Los Angeles. It was a really great opportunity for me to be a part of this and be a moderator, something I would like to do more of, just to put that energy out into the universe. But this was such a great conversation. I want to make sure that I got it out here and kind of preserved it for everyone to reference back to and check out and to connect with our panelists. So go check out the description of this episode to connect with all of our guests, and there is one good resource to check out as well that is mentioned in here as well. That can be a great takeaway with some actionable steps for folks that want to better the working conditions for graduate students on their campus. So without further ado, check out this episode 171 on graduate student wellness from the Times Higher Education Campus Live event. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this panel discussion focused on the graduate student experience and strategies to improve their working conditions, their wellness. So we'll do quick intros and then get into the conversation. So my name is Dustin Ramsdell. I'm the founder and host of the Higher Ed Geek podcast, here to moderate the discussion with our fine panelists here. So we'll just go down the row if everyone wants to give a brief intro.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Miller. I am the Vice President of the National Association of Graduate Professional Students, and I have my MHSA from the University of North Texas, currently attending the University of the People for an MBA.
Hi everyone, my name is Gwen Chodur. I am a PhD candidate, literally weeks away from being able to use that doctor at the front of my name. I am studying nutritional biology at UC Davis. I spent 5 years as a member of our executive council there in various roles for our Graduate Student Association. I was the president of the UC Graduate and Professional Council for 2 years, the president of NAGPS, as well as the director of social justice concerns the year before that. And somehow during 2020, I also found the time to be on the executive board of our UAW 2865, which is the union that represents TAs, readers, and tutors throughout the University of California system.
My name is Kaylynne Glover. I did finish my PhD at the University of Kentucky, where I was involved in the graduate student government in a lot of different capacities. Formerly Director of Legislative Affairs for the National Association of Graduate Professional Students, authored a policy brief on graduate student life in response to information we learned from the Hill, co-founded, and specifically in my capacity here, co-founder of a project specifically targeted to get the federal agencies to step in when there are mentorship issues, called FARM, Framework for Accountability in Academic Research and Mentoring.
And my name is Rachael Kuintzle. I am a PhD candidate in biochemistry and molecular biophysics at Caltech. I am the co-chair of the Caltech Graduate Student Council Advocacy Committee and the founder and co-chair of the Graduate Student Action Network, which is a national coalition of grad leaders and other student advocates, mobilizing students to make change and advance disability justice and equity for gender and racial minorities.
So, our focus here, the title of the session kind of says it, it's a reality check. Things in the graduate student space, there's been room for growth and improvement, I think, for a long time. And as with many things, those kind of issues and gaps were laid bare that much more over the past 2 years. So, we'll be focusing on kind of multiple facets of that conversation, mostly focused on kind of the on-ground research experience for master's, PhD students in those populations. So, we'll just cover as much as we can in the time that we have, but and I guess we'll maybe just kind of reverse order, have everyone kind of speak to the next question of why this issue of kind of the ill-defined space between graduate students and staff is so important just from your perspective at this moment.
So one unique thing about this moment is what Nature called the Great Resignation. We're seeing a lot of people leave academia, and people are asking, why is that happening? So there's a lot of reasons. There's some financial reasons which others will talk about. But one key issue is that people are, as people leave, they're speaking up more about the conditions that they endured. They're being more open in the wake of the Me Too movement and the George Floyd protests, which raised our awareness of systemic racism and sexism in the Me Too movement as well. People are raising awareness about abuse and discrimination and harassment that was endured, and how abusers are often tenured professors that aren't being held accountable. And then there's also people are speaking up about work-life balance issues and unrealistic expectations, and so folks are questioning whether to enter and stay because you're seeing people speak up about these realities.
Yeah, and I would say that it's always been important, and it's just been historically neglected. It's been written off as, this is just how academia works. Researchers are trained in an apprenticeship model, and how I was trained is how I'm going to train, and this is just the way it is. And that leads to very little oversight, very little recourses, no student rights protections on campuses. And then for those who are not necessarily research bound, but are like professional track students, in that case, the universities often treat us as though we are just temporary customers who are willing to pay whatever we're going to need to pay in order to make the money to get the license to, make more money later on. So I don't want to use the phrase cash cow, but apparently at least one of us on board have been told that by university administrators before.
Yeah, and so I think I'm very much in agreement with both of the panelists who went before. These are historical issues that are getting more attention. And I think another place where the pandemic really crystallized this was the fact that grad students were so often left out of planning. Many universities, when they received HERF funds, didn't necessarily extend those to graduate students. I can speak to the University of California, and when our first guidance is about who was allowed on campus when, it talked about staff. It said, there were guidance for undergrads, but not so much for graduate students, and we had to stand up and say, hey, what about us? We fulfill certain roles that, are staff-like, but also student-like. And so we exist in this very nebulous space. We are, again, our roles change as we progress throughout a PhD. And there is often a lot of lack of clarity around what role we're functioning in the moment. Are we a TA when our student catches us outside of our lab to ask us a question, even though we're in the middle of running an experiment that maybe is the source of our paycheck because we're a student researcher, but is really part of our dissertation and our role as a student? There's just this, all of these roles that overlap and that we inhabit at the same time, and there wasn't necessarily consideration for the unique situations that graduate students find themselves in, on top of all of the historic abuses and increased attention to what we've been facing.
Sorry. Besides the last 2 years with NAGPS, I was also previously the Graduate Student Council President at University of North Texas. I was inducted in October of 2019, and I kind of always laughed because I didn't get to have a normal tenure as a GSC president. I got 2020, and then I got 2021. And what I learned during that time as a master's student, I did not have financial support. I got $1,000 a year, and they said, this is for you, good luck, make it work. I had loans. I was not on anyone's research committee. I was not working for the university outside of my role in the student government. So I was not beholden to anyone. I was beholden to the students and had a little bit of a unique position as a master's student to represent the students and to actually have hard conversations with the faculty and staff that my predecessors who were PhD students couldn't, because there was always the potential for retaliation. And the thing that I learned in that time, those 2 years, was that when I would walk into a student space where there were undergraduate students, they would look at me and go, what are you doing here? You're a staff member. But then I would walk into the staff and the faculty spaces and they would say, what are you doing here? You're a student. And so then I'd go home and look in the mirror and go, what the hell am I? I don't know. I'm not supported, I know that. And that's a feeling that was echoed in my constituents and in my colleagues in my program and without. And the weird thing about it is the segue into not just university life, but in real life too. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have ever driven on a road? Probably all of you. Have ever been to a doctor? Probably all of you at least once. And maybe seen a lawyer for something. probably at least once in your life, or you will in the future. Congratulations, you have directly and indirectly benefited from graduate educated people, whether they're professional students, master's students, PhDs, or certificate holders. Civil engineers, lawyers, doctors, these are all graduate and professional students. But when they're actually receiving their educations before they get to the point of going on to do those things that you all benefit from, that we all benefit from, they're subjected to, as some of my colleagues on the panel have noted, abuse at the hands of faculty members, occasionally at the hands of other students, including undergraduate students, and low support. Even the PhD candidates with their tuition reimbursements and their salaried TA-ships and RA-ships and all of that, on average, depending on the school you look at, are receiving a lot less than people in other states, and we won't even talk about Europe. I looked it up the other day. The average TA in Europe makes $50,000 a year. I won't go down that path, though. But it's a weird space to be in. You're not really a student, but you're not a faculty or staff member either. But you're expected to, when you go into the faculty spaces, the staff spaces, to act like a student. But when you go into the student spaces, you're given the same level of responsibility and accountability, or lack thereof on occasion, as the faculty and the staff. And that is the scope of the problem.
Yeah, and I just want to say, because I know you're a little exasperated as you're getting into your answer, like this is your all's lived through experience, your perspective that you're sharing here, so I just want to thank you very much for being candid about everything, because this is just, again, the reality check. Like, it's not, just the maybe idealized notions of what this is or should be or anything like that. It is this sort of ill-defined space, I think it will be the concept that we keep coming back to, and I think you just set up, Tiffany, so I'll just come back to you, just sort of trying to kind of dig deeper on that ill-defined space, kind of provide more of the tangible pieces of it. We'll go to Kaylynne after this, but so if you want to just explore that ill-defined space that seems to be kind of the source of much of the frustration and issues and everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just, everyone always wants to talk about pay. Everyone always wants to talk about funding. It's not just those things. And having those things at higher levels would certainly help, but it's also the general attitude that is given or projected onto graduate students. And like I think it was Kaylynne mentioned earlier, I've literally heard faculty in meetings say, well, when I was in graduate school, this is verbatim quoting someone from my university in one of the science departments. When I was in grad school, I had to have a little baby under my arm and do my experiments at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning, and nobody took me seriously. And it's not that bad for you. So why are you complaining? This was a conversation a PI had with a graduate student that was sitting in front of me in the GSC office, sobbing their eyes out, asking, what do I do? I'm being expected to work, and this is the ill-defined space, right? Are you a faculty member? Are you a student? Your contract says you only have to work, and you're only supposed to work 20 hours a week. But your PI is sitting in front of you and telling you you have to be there 40 hours a week, 8 to 5, 9 to 6, and if you're not there, there is someone waiting in line behind you that would be all too happy to have your spot. And that was a domestic student. The international students have it worse, because by law, they're not allowed to work more than 20 hours a week, and if it is found out that they are working more than 20 hours a week, even unpaid, they can lose their visa. Am I a faculty member or am I a student? I mean, that's the crux of the issue, in my opinion, and in my experiences with students. It's this expectation that is unattainable, and it's based on an idea that I suffered, therefore you must also suffer. And if you're suffering less than me, then I'm doing good. I'm doing a good job.
Well, and it's almost a thing where, like, you're so close because you're acknowledging that you also suffered decades ago, but you're not being like, wait a second, maybe it shouldn't be this. Like,
right
so,
there.
But I know, Kaylynne, you have quite a few stories and stuff, so I know, given time, we can't probably tell all of them in their entirety, but if you just want to share, about sort of that power balance of those things that you experienced.
Yeah, and I, before I get to the stories, because I got them, the power imbalances, I think, is really crucial because you can get into some sticky ethical situations. You have faculty who are like, no, you're a colleague, you're a peer, we're going to co-author together, we're going to do our research together, you call me by my first name, I get to know your spouse, your partner, Our kids might go to the same daycare. You know, we have this dynamic, social, casual relationship. And then you also sit in my class and I give you a grade. And then I sit on your dissertation committee and that thing that you shared with me in private might come out. That's an ethical problem. That is inappropriate as a dynamic in this scenario. And yet that's what we have to live in. And often when you have these kinds of relationships, you have an HR department that can step in, or you have student rights that list what is or is not appropriate. Graduate students are often excluded from either of those. HR will say you're not technically considered an employee through our departments, and so there's nothing that we can do to help. And student rights, depending on whether or not the university has thought to bother, will or will not include anything. As a result, you have this lack of boundaries that allow for behaviors to bleed over. And I think a big problem is that whenever we mention this, faculty are like, well, I would never do that. I view you as a friend. Like, we're colleagues. That's the problem. You don't experience the kind of power imbalance because you're the person in power. We're not. We're sitting here wondering how what I might accidentally say at your house, this party to welcome new students, is going to be used against me, because it happens. And one of the reasons why we are so passionate about this is because there are real tangible effects of this. In case you don't know, but there's a graduate student mental health crisis. 40% of graduate students have moderate to severe anxiety or depression. These are rates 2 to 3 times higher than the undergraduate populations. 10% are suicidal. Whenever we talk about the experiences we've had on campus talking to university administrators, they tell us that the suicides that are happening are not talked about because it makes them look bad, because they're happening. Now, we can talk a little bit about my experiences. I just finished after 7 years. I relocated my family across the country to work with an advisor. I found out after I'd been there, he had not graduated a PhD student in 10 years. Information that had been covered up. He was abusive, controlling, domineering, demeaning. I would get emails late at night, why aren't you working? Expecting me in the labs on the weekends. I still have many emails from him that all illustrated all of this. The time I came in, there were 4 PhD students, 5. They had all left after 3 years. After 2 years, I was the only one left. The only ones who were able to stick around had co-advisors, switched to a master's, or switched labs. Those that he still had influence over, because in switching out of somebody's lab doesn't mean that they leave your dissertation committee. He retaliated against on their committees, just saying the most horrible things in their defenses and so forth. Doesn't technically count as being protected under university retaliations. By the time I decided to leave, we had gotten to the point of sexual harassment. And I knew that I could actually get out at that point because I had moved across the country with my son to be in this person's lab. And where else would I go? Because he was also the only faculty member who could have supported my research. And so I was in a very precarious situation. Luckily, I was able to find somebody to support me, which we'll get there. Eventually went to Title IX. They conducted their investigation. They said that no one should ever have to be in the kind of environment I was in, but it wasn't enough sex-based discrimination for it to count as a Title IX violation, because if you want to get into the policy aspects, DeVos was in charge at the time. So luckily I was able to get in somebody else's lab, and I was able to get out of his. The primary reason I filed the Title IX was because I knew that in doing so, any student who was listed, who was interviewed, or was in any way involved with him or the situation would be protected through the Title IX office. I had been working in I have been in higher ed for 14 years at this point. So I knew that. And I wanted to make sure that the students who I knew had left and were still facing retaliation could not be further retaliated against. So at this point, because of the stress that I had been under, because he was requiring me to work so often, I had developed multiple physical problems. I have currently widespread musculoskeletal dysfunction that results in neurological and mobility issues because of the kinds of working conditions I had during my graduate program. The department did not provide for any accommodations whenever I was needing them in terms of me trying to attend different events, being on campus, doing my research. I had to spend one entire year where my lab was officially a classroom, like a class lab, because they didn't have space for me, which meant that I couldn't do my research at like normal times or have like a place to sit. Whenever I tried to get disability support for me working at home, disability services was like, well, that's not actually student work you're doing, that's like research, so can't help you. So I was denied disability access for the things I need. Luckily, they were able to take me to and from campus because I lived on campus. So to get to my various doctor's appointments, which were also on campus, I was able to get that, but not all of them. So those I had to negotiate. So my new advisor was willing to take me on, but he never read any of my work until 1 week before I had to turn in my dissertation to my committee. Thus got no feedback on it. My committee all had to change, so this gets into some of those, what is going on with like official people serving on a dissertation committee. Exams are like protected under students, there are requirements. Not always the case for dissertations. My entire dissertation committee had to change after my proposal, and I was already doing research, due to their own changes at the university. As a result, I had several of them who did not know what my research was on, thought I knew different content, so I had to stick around an extra year and a half to learn that content. So that was fun. Whenever I told other graduate students in my department that this was a thing that is currently happening, my department chair in DGS retaliated against me and started a smear campaign. That was fun. I go to the Ombud to try to get some degree of protections. We go through the university's like student rights, what they can protect. Nothing in there about graduate students. All exams, all homework, all those kind of responses. Nothing about dissertations, defenses, theses, proposals, anything. When we say that these are real and tangible issues, we mean it. I started doing graduate student advocacy before these issues happened. And throughout my entire experience, I continued to hear these things from others. I was the one who could say something, though. No one should get disabled from getting a graduate degree.
Thank you for sharing your story, because I think it really does capture that ill-defined space and then sort of the negative impacts that come of it. And I think throughout that story, obviously you shouldn't have had to endure what you endured, but one big aspect of it is, because we've acknowledged, I think, the financial aspects of this issue, where certainly graduate students should get paid more, but then there's also you needed transportation, you needed healthcare, you needed, perhaps childcare, all these aspects of financial burdens that, oftentimes, again, are overlooked, or, there are resources that are available to staff or undergraduate students, but not explicitly graduate students. So we'll spend a brief moment on the financial issues and how they impact graduate students specifically. So we'll start with you on this one, Gwen, and then we'll go to Rachel.
Yeah, so in addition to my advocacy roles and leadership roles, I've been very involved with basic needs work, both on my campus and within the community. And the UC was one of the first to talk about undergrad student food insecurity. It was about 45% in 2016. So roughly half of the undergraduate students were food insecure. And this number got a lot of attention. Other institutions really started talking about it then. And you find pretty consistent numbers elsewhere. But one thing that gets lost in that same report was that 25% of graduate students were also food insecure. And that isn't, no, it's not as bad as undergrads, but it is still almost twice the general population. And there are very unique challenges towards being a graduate student. So again, for most of us, our advisors are our source of funding. They're the ones who pay us. They're the ones who give us a job, who, if they don't have research funds to have somebody as an assistantship for a semester, oh, well, you can TA for me, and then you're covered. So you're highly dependent not only on your advisor for your own progression as a student, but also for your financial well-being. Additionally, there are a lot of setups within institutions that really also challenge grad students. You get treated almost as colleagues. Hey, we should go and present at this conference. But it's a very different reality to have to wait on a reimbursement when you are only making $2,000 a month and are spending more than 50% of that on your rent, which is the case for many grad students. The average grad student in the US makes about $21,000 a year, which is only just above the poverty line in most places, and then depending on the program is in, there's variability in that. But to have to put out money from your own pocket to go to a conference that your advisor wants you to do because you're friends and it's important for your networking and for your development and for your progression, that puts a huge financial burden on students. There are also issues, of course, with things like pay cycles, needing to have some of the other fees and costs that are associated with, just performing some of the things that you do as a grad student. Needing to have certain types of, so I do bioclinical research for the most part for my dissertation. And because I see study subjects in that context as a healthcare professional, I also need to carry liability insurance. My university doesn't cover that. I have to pay for that, even though it's a necessary thing for me to do as part of my job, or as part of the job that I've been hired for by the university. That's not funded into the budget. That's not baked in. And so these are just some of the general challenges, specifically in meeting some of them, though it's also really challenging for grad students. So we ended up starting a graduate student pantry on our campus because we knew that even though we heard from our grad students that even though they were struggling and they could benefit from it, they didn't feel comfortable going to the undergraduate student pantry because they might see their students and then have to go to class and teach that student and stand in front of that student having just seen them in the pantry. And they felt like shame because of that. And that's not how it should be. I mean, you can't do your best work if you're hungry. You can't do your best work if you're worrying about how you're going to pay your rent that month. You are, if you are waiting on a reimbursement, why has it taken 3 months for me to get a reimbursement for this flight? That's time that takes away from supposedly the only 20 hours that you're supposed to be working. And then, of course, there are some of the other, expectations that are put on students or students in leadership. When I was the president of our system-wide graduate student organization, I would routinely get calls from career staff well after working hours, including ones at 10:30 at night on a Thursday. And just the expectation was I was going to answer, I was going to be available, and I was going to be there. We get asked to do things a lot for our advisors that are not paid for or covered. We're friends, so you'll cover my class for me. You can give that lecture. It's great experience. It's great exposure, but there's no pay for the hours that you put into that. They're
digging through trash once. That was fun.
Yeah. And so that's just for general grad students, and I think, and then I think Rachael can speak a little bit to some of the, experience of some of our marginalized populations as well, who have even more challenges.
Yeah, just briefly, one of the additional consequences of not paying graduate students enough is that is the diversity problem, right? So, universities are being more vocal about wanting to recruit and retain students from marginalized backgrounds and more women and minoritized genders. But the problem is the only people who can survive on a graduate student stipend are folks who are getting extra support from their parents or from their spouses, and or who are non-disabled and don't have medical debt. And so if universities really want to do a better job at recruiting a diverse student population and really recruiting the top talent from from this country and beyond. They need to pay students more and also provide financial support, extra needs-based support for students from low-income backgrounds and disabled students and student parents, right? So yeah, one more, I guess, brief thing is like it's very, very expensive to be a parent. You really can't be a parent and a student at the same time. And this is making a lot of people, and especially women, choose to leave academia. If you want more women to, be postdocs and become professors, you have to make it financially possible to be a parent and a student. Yeah.
Yeah.
So much. I feel like so much of this stuff too is like, any of those like other duties where it's just like, you don't pay me enough for this. Like I kept like ringing in my head where it's just like, you're asking me to do what? You don't pay me enough for this. You barely pay me at all. And the other thing too that I think just to have it kind of connecting with dots in people's heads is like a lot of these, things that institutions aren't willing or able to put up the funding to create childcare opportunities or, healthcare or these various kind of things. I think for public institutions at least, there's just been so much of a dwindling of state support for higher education. And it's like if they had more money, this would probably be some of the stuff that they could spend it on, is like covering that insurance, covering, for somebody to get transportation, get childcare. So I think, this is just one more manifestation of sort of the casualties of sort of the lack of investment in higher education as that public good. It's just going to come up in so many different ways. But
yeah, and I mean, to tie all of that together, another group that is really disadvantaged by our current system is international students. And international students are rarely eligible for certain types of aid. Their visa is really dependent on their student status, and so, if they do find themselves in a poor advising situation, it's even more difficult for them to switch and make a change because they, are dependent on remaining a student to stay in the country because of the way their visa systems work. Additionally, this was something else that we found really challenging during the pandemic is that international student and out-of-state student fees at public institutions aren't typically covered in tuition remission costs. And so we found ourselves in a situation at UC where we have all of these students who ended up adding a year to their graduation or to their degree timeline or things like that through no fault of their own because we're in a global pandemic and everything is shut down. And then they come back and, everybody's really excited and willing to get back to work. But then, to hear, well, you didn't meet the benchmarks and the timelines, so you have to pay these out-of-state fees now. That'll be $15,000. And yes, we know that you're TAing, 50 hours a week, 50%, which is 20 hours a week, and you make $24,000 a year, but, you're good. Like, this is what you need to do to finish. And there just isn't support and recognition for the challenges that things face. And I know that Tiffany said this and Kaylynne said this as well, that there's this idea that people are just in line to take positions that PhD student has. And in many fields, that's just not necessarily true. There might be a lot of applicants, but when we're talking about PhD students and master's students and professional students, we're talking about people with really highly specialized skill sets in many ways, that there are probably only a few people in the world who have the technical expertise to do some of these things. I know, I'm finishing, my advisor is paying me to stick around for an extra 6 months because some of the techniques that I have brought into our lab, I'm the only person who does them. So getting all of the other students up and running with them, is extra work that I'm going to take on, and thankfully she's in a position to pay me, but there are lots of people who don't get that. So this idea that, we're replaceable, or that, some of the xenophobic comments that international students have to deal with, like, oh, you're taking a spot from an American student, that's just not true, and we really need to value this population more and support them more because they deserve it, and they're, doing very important work that they're very well qualified for. So that's another soapbox that I've been.
Well, I think that's...
We have several.
It's sort of the vibe for this reality check. But and I think something else that it just makes me think of too, that it's probably very interconnected with this issue, since graduate students often are teaching classes and all that kind of stuff is adjunct instructors, and just across the board how much institutions rely on this labor and essentially kind of a race to the bottom in terms of just sort of like, how little can we pay as many people as possible to do all the teaching and, this or that of the institution. And I think, certainly thanks to the work that you all are doing, and others, I think finally kind of there being a bit of a reckoning for this. And I think you all also have a good perspective on, trying to take kind of the optimistic point of view on this of kind of strategies that can be implemented to improve, this kind of issue here. So I think we'll just go down from Tiffany down through the rest of the panel here of specific strategies that institutions can implement to create these healthier working environments, to address this ill-defined space problem.
One of the things that I did enjoy during my time at UNT was the level of involvement I was allotted on, faculty search committees. And when they were hiring on a university president my freshman year, I know for a fact they had the SGA and GSC presidents for the undergraduate and graduate students on that committee helping interview the presidential candidates. So one of the things I've always advocated for is, within reason, include students on these important committees in these meetings. If you're going to have a meeting about students or about something that's going to impact students, it kind of makes sense to have a student there, and not just so you can say, well, we had a student in the room, so sorry y'all didn't like the results of XYZ, but we did have a student representative there. If you're doing it to have them there so that you can have a witness to a decision you made, that's not it. That ain't it. That's not the vibe. You need to have them there, include them, and listen to them. Point blank, end of story. And I guess sort of my little closing statement with that is this. When I was 15, my mother was arrested and sent to a federal prison. And I was, in the great state of Texas, a ward of the state until I was 18. I did not have a home during that period. My university was my home. So I did my undergrad, I did my grad degree. I know it's tough on the faculty, staff, and administrator side to hear someone poke holes in the things that you're doing, because on that end, you're seeing all the good things you're doing. And you're going, but I'm trying so hard and I'm working and I'm putting an effort and investing to try to make things better for students. All you're doing is complaining. It's not it. For me and a lot of the students at my university, if I came home today and my door was ajar, and my windows were broken, and there were shingles missing from the roof, I would do something to fix it. Because that's my home. And I take pride in my home, and I want it to be in the best possible condition because of the good parts, because of the crown molding and the lovely wood floors. You get the analogy. So when you hear people like us that are putting themselves out there, or students that are putting themselves out there in front of you and saying, you need to do better, it's because they care. So that is my advice. Invite them into the space. The pertinent negative in the medical field, I'm a healthcare administrator, is the thing that isn't happening, and there's a reason why. If you're going into these spaces in these meetings and there's not students there, there's a reason why. You need to get them in there. They need to be part of the conversation, because any results that come out of that conversation are meaningless without them. You do not have a university if you don't have students. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
I didn't cry this time. We got close, but it didn't happen.
No, yeah, I agree with you completely. We raise these things. My graduate experience has been very challenging, but I say, I am doing this because I care enough to do it, and I'm able to do it, and I'm very thankful for the ability to do it. But I think one thing that the universities can and should do is first of all, recognize the value of the labor of students. And I know this is very topical given what is happening at my institution, but if your students are unionizing and they're making demands, instead of saying, no, there's no room for that in the budget, or no, that's not a worker issue, maybe it's a better solution to come to the table. Not maybe, I'm not going to couch this. It's a better solution to come to the table and say, let's talk about creative ways to address this. How can we go to the state together and ask for more funds? How can we rethink this? Like, we are very smart, we are very intelligent, we are very passionate people with a lot of creativity, and so we are looking for solutions. We want to help you find solutions. We will come at you and complain about everything that is wrong. We will let you know when things are not working the way that they're supposed to, when people who, have been systematically disadvantaged are continuing to be taken advantage of in the system. But you need to work with us, and we have a lot to offer in that space. So recognizing graduate students as employees with a high degree of value, especially relative to our pay. We bring a lot of added value to these conversations, but recognizing our rights and our right to demand that there are better working conditions for us, because this is a job. This is a full-time job.
I mentioned that one of the projects I helped found was FARM, Framework for Accountability in Academic Research and Mentoring. One of the publications we have is a one-pager on immediate needs at research institutions. There are 3 things on that list, all of which we have identified as being relatively easy to implement, or a semester or less, and at low cost. They are: advisor flexibility inherent to your program's structure. Any student who comes in needs to be able to switch advisors if they need to, without having to change their entire lives. Okay, that needs to be a genuine practical ability. Number 2, mentorship approval process external to professorship. External body in a different department, somebody in the graduate school, there needs to be some sort of training that says, hey, just because you can do research doesn't mean you can teach other people. You should have authority over these students, okay? Complete and utter authority. That means training in things like management, conflict resolution, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Veto power. Somebody needs to be able to come in and say, that person has not been following university metrics, they haven't attended this training. For the next 6 months, their students need to be under someone else. Something like that. The third one is the adoption of mutually agreed upon, mutually developed, and academically binding mentorship agreements. Things that are unique to each student-advisor relationship. When they come in, they work out, okay, these are the things that I, as your advisor, can provide you. These are things you, as my research trainee, are going to do in the lab. I'm not going to email you after this time, or don't expect to get this within this time. And that can be updated regularly. And violations can fill in gaps where there's student rights violations and so forth. But those 3 things can be implemented relatively quickly and can dramatically improve the conditions of your students on campus.
I want to add some suggestions for how universities can improve the diversity of their programs and recruit and retain more students from minoritized backgrounds and historically underrepresented groups. As I mentioned before, there have to be financial systems in place to support students to succeed who don't have extra financial support from their parents or from a spouse. So that means need-based extra stipends for low-income or disabled students, and childcare subsidies, and reasonable parental leave policies for student parents. In addition to that, one of the big reasons that women and racial minorities are not graduating or are going from their postdoc to industry is because of systemic sexism and racism. And so there has to be a system of accountability put into place, like third-party groups to investigate tenured professors and hold them accountable. Title IX isn't cutting it. Most of my women grad student friends have filed complaints with Title IX that have not gone anywhere for harassment and discrimination, including myself. This is something that almost all graduate student women face. And you're going to keep losing women and you're going to keep losing racial minorities unless you start holding people accountable.
So we are coming up on time, but we wanted to have one final question that I put to the panel. One final thought, call to action, takeaway, if you want to just be super short, concise, clear to the point. Any final thoughts from our panelists here as we conclude the panel? Start with you, Tiffany, and go down. You've all shared such incredible thoughts already, but just wanted to make sure to leave that window open as we wrap up here.
I can't say it better than the anecdote of listen to listen, not just to hear, not just to respond.
Yeah. Recognize how much your graduate and professional students have to offer the institution, both in terms of their expertise, but also their creativity.
Your ability to earn a graduate degree should not depend on how much abuse you're willing to tolerate.
And I think you all covered it.
I agree. I think accountability, including graduate students in the process, and not looking at this as some sort of like hazing. I think so many things are like that in society, and we can all play a part in breaking that cycle. And again, I appreciate you all for sharing your stories, taking time to talk about everything, and the hard work that you all do every day to advocate for graduate students. And thanks to everybody for hanging out and being a part of our session here. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast.